A gorilla escaped the zoo and everyone fled, but he stopped when he saw this 6-year-old. A crowd of 300 people can go silent in less than 4 seconds. Not the silence of a library, not the polite hush before a performance. The other kind, the kind that spreads from person to person like a held breath, when something happens in front of you that your brain refuses, for one suspended moment, to classify as real. That silence happened on a Tuesday morning in September, in the central plaza of the Hargrove Wildlife Conservation Park, 43 miles outside Atlanta, Georgia, and in the middle of it stood a 6-year-old girl and a 200-kilo mountain gorilla, separated by less than 2 meters of open air. Neither of them was moving. The transfer was supposed to take 11 minutes. Hargrove's Great Ape facility ran 2 separate gorilla habitats, the main western enclosure, a 2-acre naturalistic space visible from the park's primary viewing deck, and the eastern holding area, a reinforced back-of-house structure used for medical procedures, feeding management, and the occasional intergroup separation. Moving animals between the two required a choreography of pneumatic gates, electronic locks, and a minimum of 4 trained handlers working in coordinated sequence. The pneumatic gate on Corridor B had been flagged 3 weeks earlier. A maintenance report, internal, submitted digitally, assigned a priority rating of moderate, noted that the compression cylinder was operating below spec. The repair order sat in a queue. The facility director, a man named Gerald Osei, who had worked with primates for 22 years and who would spend the rest of his life replaying the morning, had approved the transfer anyway. The gate had held on 4 previous transitions. The weather was good. The male was calm. His name was KONGA. He was 19 years old, a silverback. The full silver-gray saddle across his back, gleaming in the morning light the way it only does on a male past his prime growing years, settled into his full authority. He stood 1.80 meters at the shoulder when knuckle-walking. He weighed 212 kilograms. His arm span measured 2.6 meters. He had lived in Hargrove since age 3, when he arrived as an orphan from a conservation program in Rwanda, after his birth group was decimated by illegal logging activity that drove them into contact with a farming community. He was not aggressive. This is important. 19 years of behavioral records showed a gorilla that was socially dominant, as any silverback must be, but not impulsive. He had never charged a keeper unprovoked. He had never injured another animal without clear provocation. He had passed every behavioral assessment Hargrove administered, including the stress response protocols that evaluated how great apes reacted to unexpected stimuli. He had never been outside his enclosures. The gate failed at 10:14 a.m., not catastrophically, not with a bang. The compression cylinder released pressure at 30% capacity instead of the required 90%, and the electromagnetic lock on the outer panel, designed as a redundant failsafe, had been left in manual override mode by a handler who'd used it the previous afternoon for a routine check and had not reset it before going home. 2 failures, 1 gate, and KONGA, walking the perimeter of Corridor B the way he did every morning because he was a creature of routine, and routine was one of the things that kept a 19-year-old silverback stable in captivity. KONGA hit the gate at the precise moment when both failures aligned. His shoulder connected with the panel swung, and for the first time in 16 years, there was nothing between a 212-kilogram gorilla and open ground. He stopped in the doorway. Later, keepers who reviewed the security footage would describe what happened next with the same word, independent of each other, without coordination. They would all say, "He looked." He stood in the doorway of Corridor B and turned his head slowly, left to right, like a man stepping out of a building and checking the street in both directions. His nostrils flared. His eyes, dark, deep-set, ringed with the leathery black skin of an adult male, moved across the landscape with a methodical attention that was, by any measure, intelligent. He saw the park, the paths, the trees, the plaza 60 meters ahead, where the morning crowd moved in loose clusters. He walked forward. It started with one scream. A woman near the Corridor B service entrance, a park visitor who happened to be looking in the right direction at the wrong moment, saw the shape emerge from the maintenance door. She screamed, short, high, instinctive, and that sound spread through the crowd the way a crack spreads through ice. 3 people turned to look, saw what she saw, and then the crowd became a different thing entirely. 300 people do not flee in an organized way. They flee the way water finds an exit, in every direction at once, colliding, redirecting, pouring through gaps. Strollers were abandoned, a food cart overturned, sending hot coffee across the plaza stone. A child fell and was pulled upright by a stranger's hand. People who had been looking at their phones 60 seconds ago were now running full speed in directions they hadn't chosen, propelled by a force older than any decision they could consciously make. The noise was total. Screaming, shouting, the crash of overturned equipment, the distant crackle of a security radio beginning its frantic activation, the emergency alert system in the park, triggered by a keeper who hit the panic button at 10:15 and 12 seconds, began its broadcast. All guests, please proceed immediately to the nearest marked exit. This is not a drill. KONGA moved through the chaos like something that had stepped out of a different time. He did not charge. He did not vocalize. Not yet. He walked on all fours at a pace that was, by gorilla standards, moderate. His knuckles hit the plaza stone with a sound like a slow drumbeat. Each step was deliberate. He turned his head, tracking the movement of the crowd, the noise, the blur of color and motion. His shoulders were hunched in the characteristic posture of a silverback reading a social situation. Not the chest-pounding display of aggression, but the compressed, attentive stillness of an animal that is not yet sure what it is looking at. He was frightened. This is also important. 19 years of behavioral science have established that gorillas experience fear, that the unfamiliar, the loud, the overwhelming, these produce stress responses in great apes that are physiologically identical to human anxiety: elevated cortisol, accelerated heart rate, heightened startle response. KONGA had never heard a crowd of 300 people run and scream. He had never stood on open stone under open sky with nothing between him and the horizon. He was not a predator assessing prey. He was a displaced animal in a state of extreme stress, in a world that made no sense. And then the crowd thinned, scattered, ran, and in the middle of the plaza, in a space that had been full of people 30 seconds earlier, there was a child, alone. Maya Carvalho was 6 years old, 4 months and 11 days. She was small for her age. Her pediatrician had noted it at every checkup, and her mother had stopped worrying about it when Maya's first-grade teacher described her as compact rather than small, which was, the teacher explained, a different thing entirely. She had her father's eyes, dark, wide-set, with the kind of steadiness that adults sometimes find disconcerting in children because it looks like the attention of someone who has already decided something. She had her mother's hands, narrow, long-fingered, her mother's hands. She had gotten separated from her father in the first surge of the crowd. He had been holding her hand, was certain of it, had been holding it, and then the woman screamed, and the crowd moved, and the pressure of 200 bodies redirecting simultaneously had been stronger than a father's grip on a small wrist. He had turned, screamed her name, fought against the flow. A security officer had grabbed his arm, pulled him toward the exit, and he had fought against that too, shouting until he broke free and turned back toward the plaza. Maya had not run. This was not, her father would explain afterward to every journalist, every researcher, every person who asked. This was not bravery. Maya did not process the situation the way the adults around her had processed it. She had been in the middle of looking at a butterfly on a bench when the crowd began to move, and by the time she understood that something had changed, the crowd was already gone, and she was standing in a plaza that had been full of noise and was now full of silence, and in the distance, coming toward her, was the largest living thing she had ever seen. She stood very still, not frozen, not paralyzed. This is the distinction that child psychologists who later reviewed the footage would make repeatedly, because it matters. A frozen child shows signs of acute stress response, rigid posture, shallow breathing, eyes unfocused. Maya's posture was upright but relaxed. Her breathing was regular. Her eyes were focused, tracking, moving across the approaching gorilla with the careful attention she gave to everything she found interesting. She tilted her head slightly to the left. The gorilla slowed. He stopped 4 feet from her. The security footage, pulled from 3 camera angles, analyzed frame by primatologists who would later publish papers on it, shows the moment of deceleration beginning approximately 15 meters from the child. Not a sudden stop. A gradual reduction in pace, the knuckle steps becoming shorter, the posture shifting from forward momentum to something closer to assessment. He stopped when he was close enough to touch her without extending his arm. He raised himself slightly, not the full bipedal stance of threat display, but the partial rise of a silverback getting a better vantage point. His head was above hers by nearly a meter. He looked at her. She looked back. The distance was 4 feet. less than the width of a standard doorway. In that space, nothing happened for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. It is an extremely long time when a 212-kilogram gorilla is standing 2 meters from a child, and every trained emergency responder within the park is frozen by the identical calculation. Any action taken could be the thing that triggers the outcome they are trying to prevent. The park's head of security, a former wildlife officer named Dennis Rowe, had positioned his team at the plaza perimeter. 3 staff members, none of them armed. Hargrove's policy, written by the same conservation philosophy that built the facility, prohibited weapons in public areas. They were equipped with noise deterrence, a tranquilizer protocol that required veterinary authorization and took a minimum of 4 minutes to mobilize, and the kind of professional training that covers 100 scenarios and not this one. Rowe had his radio in one hand and his phone in the other, and he was doing what the best people in impossible situations do, holding completely still and watching, because the worst thing he could do in this moment was the wrong thing. Across the plaza, beyond the perimeter fence, a crowd of evacuated visitors pressed against the railings. Phones were out. Cameras were recording. A news crew from an Atlanta affiliate that had been filming a human interest segment about the park's breeding program had swung their equipment toward the plaza the moment the alert sounded, and their footage, broadcast live within 3 minutes, was already feeding to screens across Georgia. The world was watching a 6-year-old girl and a gorilla stand 4 feet apart in complete silence. And then KONGA did something that the primatologist, Dr. Adrienne Watkins, watching the footage in her office at Emory University 20 minutes later, would describe as the most significant spontaneous interspecies behavioral event I have seen in 30 years of great ape research. He sat down. Not the aggressive crouch of a gorilla preparing to charge, the casual weight redistributing sit of a large animal that has decided, for the moment, to stop being in a hurry. He dropped his haunches to the stone. His knuckles rested in front of him. His shoulders rounded slightly. The relaxation posture, the one keepers recognized as the signal that the silverback had assessed his situation and found it, for now, manageable. He was close enough that Maya could have reached out and touched his hand. She did. Not all at once. Not impulsively. She extended her right arm slowly, the way you extend your hand toward an unfamiliar dog, palm down, fingers loose, letting the animal decide what to do with it. Her father, watching from 40 meters away, saw it happen and said later that he could not describe the sound he made when he saw her hand moving toward that animal, except that it was not a sound he had made before or since. KONGA looked at the hand. His nostrils moved. He was reading her, the biochemistry of her skin, the scent markers that carry information no human instrument can decode. Health, age, emotional state, familiarity. His brain was running a search across 16 years of stored olfactory data, cross-referencing against a library of human sense that every great ape in captivity accumulates. Keepers, veterinarians, researchers, the recurring faces and recurring smells that constitute the social landscape of a zoo animal's world. And something in that library flagged. He did not attack. He did not vocalize. He did not retreat. He leaned his head forward almost imperceptibly, 3 centimeters, maybe 4, and exhaled through his nostrils in the slow, measured way that primatologists call a relaxed breath. It is the opposite of a threat signal. In gorilla communication, the relaxed breath directed at another individual means as close as behavioral science can translate it. I see you. I am not alarmed. Maya's hand was still extended. KONGA looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her face. Her mother's name was Elena Carvalho. She had worked at Hargrove for 9 years, first as a keeper's assistant, then as a full keeper, then as the lead behavioral researcher for the Great Ape Facility. She had a PhD from the University of Georgia. She had published 6 papers on gorilla social cognition. She had been, by every account of everyone who worked with her, exceptional, not because her credentials were remarkable, though they were, but because of something harder to quantify. She understood, in the practical, intuitive way that some people understand music or mathematics, how gorillas thought. She had died 14 months before this morning. A car accident on a highway outside the city, on a night when the rain came faster than anyone predicted, and the road became a surface that tires could not read. She was 31 years old. Maya was 4. But in the 2 years before that, the years when Elena worked at Hargrove and brought her daughter on weekends when childcare fell through, when the facility bent its own rules for a researcher whose dedication, and whose child's quiet fascination with the animals made the bend feel reasonable. Maya had spent a great deal of time in front of Konga's enclosure. Elena had told people about it, wrote about it actually in the margins of her research notes, in a way that blurred the line between professional observation and something more personal. Her daughter, she noted, had an effect on Konga that she had not observed in any other visitor. Most humans made him restless. The noise, the unpredictability, the social complexity of a crowd outside the glass. Maya made him still. Elena had measured it. Heart rate monitors attached to Konga's enclosure showed consistent drops in physiological arousal during the periods when Maya sat in front of the viewing glass. Not dramatic drops, measurable ones. The equivalent, in human terms, of the feeling you get when you come home to a quiet room after a loud day. Elena had theorized, carefully, scientifically, in the way researchers theorize when they suspect something that the field isn't ready to publish, that great apes have a more nuanced read of human emotional states than most studies acknowledged. That Konga was responding not to Maya specifically, but to what Maya was, a human being in a state of genuine, uncomplicated calm. No agenda, no fear, no performance. Just a small person looking at a large one with the kind of open curiosity that most adults had trained themselves out of. She had also taught Maya something, not formally. The way you teach a child things when you are a researcher, and the thing you are teaching lives at the intersection of your work and your love. She had taught her a gesture, a specific position of the hands, both hands, fingers extended, palms facing inward, thumbs touching, that Elena had identified through her own field research as a low-frequency appeasement signal in mountain gorilla communication. A gesture associated with submission, with non-threat, with the social negotiation that happens within gorilla groups when a lower-status individual approaches a dominant one and needs to communicate. I am not a challenge. I am not a threat. I am simply here. Elena had told Maya that this was a word in gorilla language, that it meant roughly peace. Maya had practiced it on the glass, watching Konga watch her. She had not done it in 14 months. She had not been back to the park since her mother died. Her father had not been able to bring her, not out of practical difficulty, but the kind of emotional difficulty that is harder to explain and easier to understand if you have ever tried to take a child somewhere that reminds you, in every detail, of the person who is missing. He had brought her today because her grandmother had suggested it, because it had been 14 months and grief has a timeline that other people can see more clearly than the people inside it. Because Maya had asked, twice, in the careful way she asked for things, quietly once, and then once more, without pressure, which somehow made it harder to say no than if she had asked 10 times. She had been in the park for 40 minutes, when the gate failed. Standing in the plaza now, with Konga 2 meters away and the world holding its breath, her right hand extended and her head tilted the way it had always tilted when she was thinking, she did something that nobody watching could have predicted, because nobody watching knew about the gesture except for her father, who was 40 meters away and could not get closer, and who recognized it the moment he saw her hands move into position. Both hands, fingers extended, palms facing inward, thumbs touching. She held it. On the security footage, frame by frame, you can see the exact moment Konga's behavioral state changes. His head, which had been in the neutral, scanning position of a stressed animal in an unfamiliar environment, drops 1 centimeter. The muscles along his jaw relax. The skin above his brow, which had been holding the slight tension that primatologists associate with heightened alertness, smooths out. And from deep in his throat, barely audible on the recording, barely audible to the security team standing at the plaza perimeter, a sound, low, guttural, a sustained rumble that Dr. Adrienne Watkins, reviewing the audio, would immediately identify from her database of gorilla vocalizations. A sound cataloged in Elena Carvalho's own research notes, with a notation that Dr. Watkins would find when she cross-referenced the files 6 weeks after the incident. Belch vocalization. Context. Social recognition. Produced in response to a familiar individual or known appeasement gesture. Frequency of occurrence in Konga. Rare. First documented instance, April 14th, 3 years prior, in response to researcher Carvalho and juvenile human visitor. He remembered her. 16 years of olfactory memory, 14 months of her absence, and a gesture that her mother had pulled from field research and taught to a 4-year-old at a glass wall in a conservation park, and Konga, confronted with the chaos of an escaped enclosure and a world that made no sense, had just found the one thing in it that his brain could file under known. Maya heard the sound. She lowered her hand slowly. She looked at him the way she looked at things she found beautiful. "Hi," she said. It was a child's voice. Soft, without performance. KONGA exhaled again. The SWAT unit arrived at 10:23 a.m. 4 officers, full tactical gear, positioned at the northern access point of the central plaza on authorization from the county emergency coordinator, who had been watching the news feed on his phone in his car and had made a decision without waiting for a briefing from the park director. 2 snipers took elevated positions, one on the roof of the park's education center, one on the viewing platform above the western enclosure, with clear sight lines to the plaza. A police commander took a position at the gate, radio to his ear, eyes locked on the gorilla. Dennis Rowe, the park's head of security, met the commander at the gate. "You cannot fire into that situation," Rowe said. He said it quietly, the way you say things to someone you need to listen. "There is a child in contact with a dangerous animal," the commander said. "There is a child standing near a gorilla who has not shown one aggressive behavior in 9 minutes. Rowe held up his radio. "Our veterinarian is on site. We have a tranquilizer protocol. The drug takes 3 to 5 minutes to take full effect on an animal this size. If you discharge a firearm in that space, the animal will react before he goes down. That child is 4 feet away." The commander looked at the plaza, at KONGA, at Maya, at the 4 feet of open air between them. He did not fire, but the snipers stayed in position. On the other side of the gate, Maya's father, Daniel Carvalho, 34 years old, a structural engineer who had spent the last 9 minutes in a state that no professional training addresses, was having a conversation with Gerald Osei, the facility director, that was less a conversation and more a sustained, controlled act of desperation. "The snipers," Daniel said. "Tell them to stand down. I don't have authority over county. If they fire and he reacts, you know what happens. You've worked with these animals for 20 years. You know what happens." Osei knew. A gorilla under acute threat stimulus, operating on adrenaline, could deliver a lethal strike in the fraction of a second between a gunshot's report and its physiological effect. The child was too close. The margin was too small. The risk of intervention in this scenario was greater than the risk of the situation they were watching, which for 9 minutes had been 2 individuals doing nothing but existing in each other's presence. "She's not in danger," Daniel said. He said it like a man trying to believe it. Not from him. Not right now. He's known her since she was a baby. Her mother, Elena, worked with him for 6 years. Maya used to sit at the glass for hours. Osei looked at him. Something shifted in the director's face. Recognition arriving late, connecting data that hadn't been connected until this moment. "Your wife was Elena Carvalho." "Yes." A long pause. The radio crackled. On the news feed on someone's phone nearby, a news anchor was saying the words standoff and crisis and authorities are prepared to take action. "Tell me everything about the gesture she just made with her hands," Osei said. Daniel told him. Osei made 3 calls in 90 seconds. The last one was to the county commander. Meanwhile, KONGA had noticed the snipers. Gorillas do not have the primate-specific fear of firearms that humans sometimes assume. The weapon itself means nothing to an animal with no evolutionary experience of projectile threat. But KONGA had spent 19 years reading human body language with the granular precision of a social animal whose survival in a complex group depends on accurate behavioral interpretation. He could read arousal. He could read threat posture. He could read the particular quality of stillness that a human body takes on when it is holding something and pointing it at something else, and waiting. He rose. Not a full threat display, not chest beating, that volcanic, percussive performance of dominance that silverbacks deploy when they want the world to understand who they are. Something quieter, and, in some ways, more unsettling. He rose to his full height and he turned, slowly, deliberately, and he placed himself between Maya and the northern gate where the police officers stood. His back was to her. His face was to the threat. He had made a choice. From the security footage, from the news camera, from the phones of the evacuated visitors pressed against the perimeter fence, the image was the same. A 6-year-old girl, half hidden by the mass of a silverback gorilla who stood between her and everything else in the world, his silver back catching the morning light, his posture carrying the unmistakable language of protection. Dennis Rowe watched it happen on his monitor. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said into his radio in the flattest voice he could manage, "Nobody fires. Nobody moves. We are watching an animal protect a child. Do you understand me? We are watching him protect her." On the roof of the education center, a sniper lowered his rifle 3 centimeters and waited. Maya saw what was happening. She was 6 years old, but she had her mother's capacity for reading a room, and the room right now was telling her something clear. She could see the officers at the gate. She could see the way they were standing, tight, poised, carrying the specific stillness of people who might move very fast very soon. She had not yet developed the vocabulary for tactical deployment or imminent use of force, but she understood, with the directness that children understand things before language wraps them in complication, that the men at the gate were going to do something, and that KONGA was in the way of whatever it was. She stepped around him, not quickly, not dramatically. She moved the way she had extended her hand, slowly, communicating in every millimeter of her movement that she was not startled, not fleeing, not reacting. She came around his left side and stood in front of him, facing the gate, facing the officers. KONGA turned, saw her in front of him, his brow tensed, the gorilla equivalent of a worried frown. Maya looked back at him over her shoulder. She made the gesture again. Both hands, palms inward, thumbs touching. She held it. Then she lowered her hands and she turned forward again and she took 1 step toward the gate. And then she looked back. It was not a command. She had no authority over a 200-kilo silverback. She was a child who had learned a word in a language her mother had spent years trying to understand, and she was using it the only way she knew how, as a bridge, as the thing you build between two places that cannot reach each other by themselves. KONGA watched her. 11 seconds. The same length of time as the first silence in the plaza. Then he knuckle-walked forward, following her. She walked slowly. He followed at a pace that matched hers, not because he was trained to heal, not because he recognized her authority, but because the alternative was to stand alone in an open space surrounded by threat, and this small human had just demonstrated, in the only language that transcended the gap between them, that she knew the way back. 200 meters. The plaza to the service path to the maintenance corridor, the maintenance corridor to the holding area. They walked it together. The news footage from this segment, 40 seconds, uncut, watched over 40 million times in the following week, shows a child and a gorilla moving through a park in the particular silence of two beings who have, somehow, arrived at the same understanding. Maya's steps are measured. She does not look back every 2 seconds the way a frightened person looks back. She looks back the way a guide looks back, to check, to confirm, to maintain the connection that is holding everything together. KONGA follows. His gait is the relaxed knuckle walk of a gorilla that has decided to go somewhere. Not agitated, not performing, moving. The security team on the perimeter is motionless. The snipers hold. The officers at the gate have been told, in no uncertain terms, by the county commander, who was told by Gerald Osei, who was told by Dennis Rowe, who was told by every cell in his professional body, do not move. 40 seconds, 200 meters. A child and a gorilla. At the entrance to the maintenance corridor, the open doorway that had been the beginning of all of this, 43 minutes earlier, Maya stopped. She turned fully to face KONGA. He stopped too, 2 meters back, watching her. She made the gesture one last time. Both hands, palms inward, thumbs touching. A long pause. KONGA made the sound again. The low, guttural rumble. The belch vocalization. The gorilla word for recognition. For I know you. For something that behavioral science can approximate but never fully translate. Because translation requires 2 languages and there is still, even now, only one language we have mapped with any confidence. And it is not the one he was speaking. He walked through the doorway. The gate closed behind him at 10:57 a.m. The holding area had one viewing panel. Reinforced glass 2 centimeters thick. It was not the primary public viewing glass of the western enclosure. This was the utilitarian panel that keepers used for behavioral monitoring and health observation. It was not designed to be beautiful. It did not need to be. Maya walked to it. She stood in front of the glass the way she had stood in front of glass for as long as anyone in her life could remember. Upright, still, her attention gathered into the quiet focus that was simply the way she was. On the other side, KONGA had moved to the far end of the holding space. He was doing what gorillas do after a period of extreme stress. Sitting, breathing, the visible process of physiological decompression that researchers call settling. His chest rose and fell. His hands rested on the ground in front of him, open, relaxed. Then he looked at the glass. He saw her. He moved toward the panel, not the full approach, not closing the distance between them, but half of it. He stopped and sat again, closer now, with the glass between them. His face was at her level. The size difference that had been so enormous in the open plaza was somehow different here, not because it had changed, but because the glass had changed what it meant, made it a window instead of a threat. Maya raised her hand, palm flat. She pressed it against the glass. KONGA looked at her hand, at her face, at her hand. He raised his own, a hand the size of her entire head, black-skinned, thickly padded, carrying the weight of every tree he had ever climbed and every stone he had ever moved. He pressed it against the glass on the other side, covering her small palm completely, surrounding it, the way something enormous surrounds something small and does not crush it. They held it. Daniel Carvalho, who had been allowed through the gate by the time Maya reached the holding area, was standing behind her. He said later that he did not know he was crying until he felt the wet on his face. He said he could not have explained at that moment what he was crying for. The terror that was behind him, the child in front of him, the wife who was not there and whose hands he could see in the gesture his daughter kept making, whose work and whose love had somehow crossed 14 months and 200 meters of open stone and arrived here, in this moment, holding something precious through glass. The gate had closed. The crisis had ended. The plaza would be cleaned, the corridor repaired, the incident reviewed by every relevant body, park management, county emergency services, state wildlife authority, a federal oversight committee that took an interest in great ape escape incidents. Reports would be written. Policies would be revised. The pneumatic gate would be replaced within a week. The electronic failsafe redesigned within a month. Gerald Ose would write a personal letter to the Carvalho family that would take him 3 drafts and 2 weeks to complete, because there is no template for what he needed to say. All of that would come. In this moment, there was only the glass and the 2 hands pressed against it, and a child who had walked 200 meters through a park with a gorilla following her footsteps because she knew one word in his language: peace. 7 months later, the Hargrove Wildlife Conservation Park reopened the Great Ape Facility with a new exhibit, not replacing the old one, but added alongside it. A small display, understated, in the hallway between the visitor entrance and the main viewing deck. A framed photograph, a behavioral chart, a short written description, and a plaque, in memory of Dr. Elena Carvalho, behavioral researcher, 1989-2023. Her work helped us understand that the distance between species is not measured in biology, but in willingness to listen. Maya was there for the opening. She stood in front of the plaque for a long time. Then she walked to the main viewing glass. KONGA was on the far side. He was doing what he usually did in the morning, sitting in the patch of light that came through the habitat's northern skylight, his silver back glowing the way it did, his attention moving across the space around him, with the calm authority of a silverback at rest in his world. Then he looked at the glass. He saw her. He stood, slowly, without urgency, and crossed the habitat. At the glass, he stopped, and he sat, and his eyes moved from her face to her hands, to her face again. Maya pressed her palm to the glass. A pause, long enough to feel like a breath. He reached into the grass beside him. His hand closed around something, a white stone, smooth, the size of a child's fist, one that she had left on a ledge near the glass during a visit 2 years earlier when her mother was still alive. He could not have known it was hers. He could not have known it was anything other than a stone. And yet he held it toward the glass, his massive hand open, the stone resting on his palm, offered to the boundary between them. There is no scientific explanation for this. Dr. Adrienne Watkins, who reviewed the footage and published a careful paper about it 6 months later, does not attempt one. She notes the behavior, describes it precisely, and in her conclusion, writes a sentence that is unusual in a peer-reviewed academic journal. Some things are beyond our current vocabulary. That does not make them less real. Maya touched the glass where his hand was. He held still. Outside the viewing window behind her, the morning crowd moved through the park the way crowds do, loosely in every direction, following the particular currents of interest and appetite and distraction that make up a day. A child pointed at something. Someone laughed. A stroller wheel squeaked on the polished floor, the world going on, as it does, as it always does, on the other side of the glass. Subscribe. A história seguinte já está me tirando o sono. E me conta nos comentários. Você acredita que ele reconheceu ela? Ou você acredita em algo maior do que isso? O medo humano cria monstros, mas a pureza de uma criança pode encontrar o que o medo esconde, que do outro lado do vidro sempre houve alguém olhando de volta.